She said, "that Omega will never sit at our table." Moments later, her Alpha King grandfather slammed the grand dining hall of the Ashford estate, stretched before me like a cathedral of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, their light dancing across polished mahogany and gleaming silverware. Persian rugs in deep burgundy and gold-covered sections of the marble floor, their intricate patterns speaking of centuries-old craftsmanship and wealth that transcended generations. Oil paintings of Ashford ancestors lined the walls, their stern faces watching over the room with expressions that seemed to judge everyone who entered. I stood at the threshold, my worn shoes barely crossing into the opulent space, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. My name is Elena Winters, and I was nothing in their world, a scholarship student at Crescent Moon Academy, the most prestigious boarding school in New England. My mother cleaned houses for families like these, scrubbing their toilets and polishing their silver, while they barely acknowledged her existence. My father had died when I was 7, leaving us with nothing but debt and dreams that seemed increasingly foolish with each passing year. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the south side of town, where the streets had potholes that never got fixed, and the streetlights flickered more often than they stayed lit. "You cannot be serious, grandmother." The voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade. Lady Victoria Ashford stood near the head of the table, her designer gown shimmering in the candlelight, a creation of silk and lace that probably cost more than my mother earned in 6 months. Her perfectly manicured hand gestured toward me with barely concealed disgust, diamonds glittering on her fingers. "That Omega will never sit at our table." The word hung in the air. Omega. It wasn't a term from ancient hierarchies or werewolf fiction. It was their cruel designation for people like me, the scholarship kids, the service workers' children, the ones who didn't belong in their gilded world. At Crescent Moon Academy, the social structure was rigid and unforgiving. Alphas were the legacy students, the children of old money and power, whose families had attended the school for generations. Their names were on buildings, on scholarship funds, on plaques commemorating their ancestors' achievements. Betas were the comfortable middle class, accepted but unremarkable, the children of doctors and lawyers and successful business owners who could afford the tuition but lacked the pedigree of true old money, and Omegas. We were the charity cases, tolerated only because our presence allowed the school to maintain its tax-exempt status and claim diversity in their glossy brochures. Before you continue with Elena's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, Victoria's grandmother and the matriarch of the family, had invited me to this dinner. It was supposed to be an honor. She was on the Academy's board of directors, and she'd taken an interest in my academic achievements. I'd won the state mathematics competition 3 years running, published a paper on sustainable urban development in a peer-reviewed journal at age 16, and maintained a perfect GPA while working 2 part-time jobs. I tutored younger students on weekday evenings and worked weekend shifts at a coffee shop near campus, saving every penny I could for college expenses that my scholarship wouldn't cover. Mrs. Ashford had called my achievement remarkable during a school assembly where I'd received yet another academic award. She'd approached me afterward, her kind eyes crinkling with genuine warmth, and insisted I join her family for their monthly dinner. "I want you to meet my husband," she'd said. "He founded the scholarship program, you know. He'd be so pleased to see what you've accomplished." I hadn't expected Victoria to be there. She was my classmate, my tormentor, the queen bee who made every day at Crescent Moon a calculated exercise in humiliation. She'd trip me in hallways, accidentally spill coffee on my homework, make loud comments about my thrift store clothes and secondhand textbooks. Her friends would laugh on cue, a chorus of cruelty that followed me from class to class. "Victoria, mind your tongue," Mrs. Ashford said quietly, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. Her posture remained perfectly composed, but I saw her fingers tighten slightly on her wine glass. "Why should I?" Victoria's voice rose, emboldened by the presence of her cousins and friends scattered around the table. There were perhaps 20 people in the room, all dressed in evening wear that cost more than my mother's monthly rent. She doesn't belong here. Look at her dress. Is that from a thrift store? And those shoes. Grandmother, this is embarrassing. What will people think? What will Aunt Caroline say? What will the Hendersons think when they hear we invited scholarship students to family dinners? I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. The dress was indeed from a thrift store. A simple navy blue sheath that I'd carefully altered to fit properly, spending hours at my mother's old sewing machine to adjust the hem and take in the waist. The shoes were my only pair of flats, worn but clean, the leather cracking slightly at the toes despite my best efforts to maintain them. I'd spent an hour getting ready, standing in front of the mirror in the dormitory bathroom, knowing I'd be judged, hoping desperately that I could somehow measure up to their impossible standards. People will think, came a new voice, deep and commanding, resonating through the dining hall like thunder, that this family has finally remembered what it means to have character. Every head turned toward the entrance. The man who stood there was elderly, but imposing, with silver hair swept back from a face carved by decades of authority and wisdom. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and creased his forehead, but they were the lines of someone who smiled often and thought deeply. He wore a simple but impeccably tailored suit in charcoal gray, with a blue tie that matched his eyes that were sharp and assessing, taking in everything with the gaze of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people and situations. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his worth to anyone, his posture straight despite his years. Alexander Ashford, Victoria's grandfather, former governor, philanthropist, decorated veteran, and patriarch of one of the oldest families in New England. I'd seen his portrait in the Academy's main hall. He'd founded the scholarship program 30 years ago, over the objections of the board, threatening to withdraw his family's substantial endowment if they didn't agree. The portrait showed a younger man, but with the same piercing gaze and air of unshakable conviction. Grandfather. Victoria's voice had changed entirely, becoming sugary sweet, the venom draining away to be replaced by performative affection. We didn't know you were coming. We thought you were still in Washington. Clearly. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with a single, comprehensive glance. The uncomfortable guests, his wife's tight expression, Victoria's defensive posture, and me standing frozen at the entrance like a deer caught in headlights. Then they settled on me, and something in his expression softened, the stern lines of his face relaxing into something almost gentle. You must be Elena Winters. My wife has told me a great deal about you. Please, come in. You're the guest of honor tonight. I hesitated, caught between the door and the table, between flight and fight, every instinct screaming at me to run back to campus and forget this humiliating evening had ever happened. My hands trembled slightly at my sides, and I clasped them together to hide the shaking. Mr. Ashford, I don't want to cause any trouble, I began, my voice barely above a whisper, but he raised a hand to stop me. The only trouble here is the appalling lack of manners my granddaughter has displayed. He walked toward the table with measured steps, and the room seemed to reorganize itself around his presence. Guests straightened in their chairs. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the servants standing along the walls seemed to stand at greater attention. Eleanor, my dear, I apologize for my tardiness. Traffic from the city was abominable. There was an accident on the interstate that had everything backed up for miles. He kissed his wife's cheek with obvious affection, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, and she reached up to squeeze his fingers, a gesture of long-married intimacy that spoke of decades of partnership. Then he turned to face Victoria, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by something cold and implacable. Victoria Ashford, you will apologize to Miss Winters immediately. Grandfather, Victoria's face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against her blanched skin. Immediately. The word was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone of someone who'd commanded troops in battle and governed an entire state. Someone who expected obedience not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it through decades of principled leadership. Victoria's face went even paler, then flushed with anger and humiliation. Around the table, her cousins and friends suddenly found their plates fascinating, studying the delicate china patterns as though they held the secrets of the universe. No one met her eyes. No one came to her defense. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, the words forced through clenched teeth, barely audible. "Look at her when you speak," Alexander commanded, his voice still quiet but inflexible as steel. "And speak clearly. An apology mumbled to the floor is no apology at all." Victoria's eyes met mine, and I saw genuine hatred there, barely masked by the forced contrition. Her jaw was tight, a muscle twitching near her temple. "I'm sorry, Elena. My words were inappropriate and unkind. I apologize for my behavior." "Now," Alexander continued, his voice warming slightly but still carrying unmistakable authority, "you will give up your seat." "What?" Victoria's voice cracked slightly, disbelief and horror mingling in her expression. "You heard me. Miss Winters will sit in your place, at my right hand. You may take the seat at the far end of the table." He gestured toward the distant end of the long dining table, where a single chair sat in relative isolation. The far end, the position reserved for children and those of lowest status at formal dinners, the seat where you couldn't participate in the main conversation, where you were effectively excluded from the real gathering. Victoria looked as though she'd been slapped. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, might storm out in a dramatic exit worthy of a soap opera. But something in her grandfather's gaze, something implacable and final, made her think better of it. She rose stiffly, her movements jerky with suppressed rage, and gathered her napkin with shaking hands. She walked the length of the table to the distant seat, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor between the Persian rugs. Each step seemed to echo in the absolute silence. The silence was so complete I could hear the soft hiss of the candles burning in their silver holders, the distant sound of kitchen staff working beyond the closed doors. "Miss Winters," Alexander said, his voice returning to warmth, gesturing to the now empty chair with a slight smile. "Please." I moved forward on trembling legs, acutely aware of every eye tracking my progress across that vast room. It felt like miles, though it was probably only 20 feet. The chair Victoria had vacated was still warm, the seat cushion holding the impression of her body. A servant appeared immediately, silent and efficient, to adjust my place setting, moving the silverware slightly, refilling the water glass, ensuring everything was perfectly positioned. I found myself seated between Alexander Ashford and his wife Eleanor, in the position of highest honor at one of the most powerful family tables in New England. "Now then," Alexander said, his voice returning to conversational tones as though nothing unusual had occurred, as though he hadn't just publicly humiliated his own granddaughter. "Eleanor tells me you've been accepted to MIT's early admission program. Congratulations. That's quite an achievement. The acceptance rate for that program is less than 3%, if I recall correctly." "Thank you, sir," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. "She's being modest," Eleanor interjected, her kind eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure. She reached over to pat my hand gently. "She's one of only 15 students nationwide to receive the full presidential scholarship. Full tuition, room and board, and a research stipend. They don't give those to just anyone, Alexander. The selection committee reviews thousands of applications." "Remarkable," Alexander said, and he sounded genuinely impressed, not the polite interest of someone making conversation, but real enthusiasm. "What will you study?" Civil engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure, I replied, finding my voice growing stronger. This was familiar ground. My passion, my future, the dream I'd been nurturing since I was 12 years old and watched my neighborhood flood because the city's drainage system was 50 years out of date. I want to design systems that make cities more livable for everyone, not just the wealthy. Systems that don't fail the moment you cross from affluent neighborhoods into poor ones. A noble goal, Alexander said, leaning forward slightly, his full attention focused on me, in a way that was both intimidating and exhilarating. And one that's sorely needed. I've seen too many infrastructure projects that serve the privileged while leaving the vulnerable to cope with failing systems. Tell me, what inspired this interest? Was there a particular moment or experience? As I began to explain, talking about the flooding in my neighborhood, the way poor communities bore the brunt of inadequate city planning, the bridges that were deemed too expensive to repair in our part of town, while new ones were built in wealthy suburbs, the potential for innovative solutions that could address these inequities, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. Alexander listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he actually understood the technical aspects of what I was describing. He challenged my assumptions in ways that made me think deeper, proposing scenarios I hadn't considered, pointing out political obstacles I'd need to navigate. Have you considered the funding mechanisms? He asked. Municipal bonds are the traditional approach, but they often perpetuate inequality because wealthier areas can secure better terms. Have you looked into alternative financing models? I had, and we dove into a discussion of public-private partnerships, community investment models, and innovative funding structures. Eleanor joined in occasionally, and I learned she'd served on the City Planning Commission for a decade. Other family members gradually began to participate. An uncle who worked in construction, a cousin who'd studied environmental science, even one of Victoria's friends who apparently had a genuine interest in urban development and seemed almost grateful to be able to discuss it seriously. Around us, the dinner progressed. Servants brought course after course with practiced efficiency. Butternut squash soup garnished with toasted pumpkin seeds and a drizzle of cream, arugula salad with candied walnuts and shaved parmesan in a light vinaigrette, herb-crusted lamb with roasted vegetables and a red wine reduction, and finally a delicate lemon tart with fresh berries and house-made whipped cream. The food was exquisite, each dish a work of culinary art, though I barely tasted it, too focused on the conversation and too nervous to fully appreciate the flavors. Wine flowed freely, though I stuck to water, too aware of my age and my precarious position, and the conversation expanded to include other topics. Alexander told stories of his time as governor, the battles he'd fought for education funding and infrastructure investment, the compromises he'd had to make, and the lines he'd refused to cross. Eleanor shared memories of the early days of the scholarship program, the resistance they'd faced from other board members, the satisfaction of seeing the first cohort of scholarship students graduate and go on to remarkable achievements. You know, Alexander said as the main course was being cleared, setting down his fork and leaning back in his chair with the air of someone preparing to make an important point. When I established the scholarship program at Crescent Moon, I faced significant opposition. The board argued that it would dilute the quality of the student body, that students from disadvantaged backgrounds wouldn't be able to keep up academically or fit in socially. They said it would damage the school's reputation, that alumni would withdraw their support, that it would fundamentally change the character of the institution. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant as he remembered those battles. I told them they were fools, that talent and intelligence aren't distributed according to wealth, and that the school would be stronger for embracing diversity. I told them that privilege without merit breeds mediocrity, and that competition from students who'd actually had to work for their achievements would elevate everyone. I threatened to withdraw the Ashford Endowment, which at that point represented about 30% of the school's operating budget, if they didn't approve the program. A slight smile crossed his face. They approved it. 30 years later, scholarship students have won more academic honors, more competitive awards, and more prestigious university placements than any other group at the Academy. They've gone on to become doctors and engineers, professors and entrepreneurs, public servants and innovators. They've contributed more to society than most of the legacy students, who often coast on their family names and trust funds. His eyes swept the table, landing briefly on Victoria before returning to me. The message was unmistakable. They succeed not despite their challenges, but because of them. They've learned resilience, determination, and the value of hard work, qualities that privilege often erodes. When everything is handed to you, when you never face real consequences for failure, when you never have to struggle for anything meaningful, you don't develop the character necessary for genuine achievement. The silence that followed was profound. Several of Victoria's cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of her friends was staring at her plate as though wishing she could disappear into it. At the far end of the table, Victoria sat rigid, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Miss Winters," Alexander continued, turning his full attention back to me, "I wonder if you'd be interested in an opportunity. The Ashford Foundation funds several infrastructure projects in developing communities, both domestic and international. We're always looking for bright young minds to join our summer internship program. It's paid, of course. We believe in compensating people fairly for their work, and it would give you hands-on experience in exactly the kind of work you want to pursue. You'd be working alongside professional engineers and urban planners on real projects with real impact." I stared at him, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. The Ashford Foundation was legendary in civil engineering circles. They'd funded the reconstruction of water systems in Flint, Michigan, developed sustainable housing projects in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and pioneered green infrastructure in dozens of cities. An internship there would be worth more than a year of classroom study. "Sir, I would be honored. Thank you. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll work hard and make the most of the opportunity," he replied with a warm smile. "That's all I ask. Eleanor will give you the details. The program director is a former student of mine at the university, Dr. Patricia Chen. Brilliant woman, one of the best structural engineers in the country. I'll make sure she knows to expect your application, but you'll still have to go through the formal interview process. I don't believe in nepotism or favoritism. You'll earn your place just like everyone else." As the dinner drew to a close and dessert plates were cleared away, guests began to depart. There were handshakes and air kisses, promises to meet for lunch or golf, the social rituals of the wealthy playing out in practiced choreography. Victoria was among the first to leave, her exit swift and silent, her friends trailing behind her like a diminished court. She didn't look at me as she passed, didn't acknowledge her grandparents, simply swept out with what remained of her dignity wrapped around her like a cloak. I helped Eleanor gather some of the dishes. Old habits die hard, and I felt uncomfortable being served. But she gently shooed me away with a kind but firm expression. "You're a guest, dear, not the help. Please sit. Have some more coffee." Alexander walked me to the door when it was finally time for me to leave. A car was waiting to take me back to campus. Not a taxi, but a private car with a driver. Another small luxury that felt surreal. "Miss Winters," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "I want you to remember something. The Victorias of this world will always exist. They'll try to make you feel small, to convince you that you don't belong in spaces you've earned the right to occupy. But their opinions are meaningless. What matters is your character, your work, and your determination to make the world better than you found it." He paused, his blue eyes intense and sincere. "You belong anywhere you choose to be. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. Not Victoria, not anyone. You've earned your place through merit and hard work, the only currencies that truly matter. Everything else is just noise." "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. My voice was thick with emotion, tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. For everything. For tonight. For the opportunity. For standing up for me. I didn't stand up for you, he corrected gently. I stood up for what's right. There's a difference. You would have succeeded with or without my intervention. I simply made sure the playing field was a bit more level. As the car pulled away from the Ashford estate, I looked back at the grand house, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness of the autumn night. The building was a masterpiece of colonial architecture, all white columns and red brick, with ivy climbing the walls and perfectly manicured gardens surrounding it. I thought about Victoria's face when her grandfather had commanded her to move, about the way the entire power structure of that room had shifted in an instant, about the looks on the faces of the other guests as they witnessed a public rebuke that would undoubtedly become the subject of gossip for weeks to come. But more than that, I thought about Alexander's words, about belonging and earning your place, about the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. I thought about the internship, about MIT, about the future that was opening before me, like a door I'd been told would always be locked. For the first time in my life, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could actually achieve the dreams I'd been nurturing in secret, afraid to voice them too loudly, lest they be mocked or dismissed. The next morning at Crescent Moon Academy, I walked through the halls with my head held higher than it had been in months. The campus was beautiful in the morning light, all Gothic architecture and ancient trees, buildings that had stood for over a century and would stand for centuries more. Victoria and her friends whispered as I passed, huddled in their usual spot near the main entrance, their hostility palpable even from a distance. But it didn't touch me the way it once had. I'd sat at their table, literally and figuratively, and I'd proven I belonged there. In calculus class, Victoria refused to look at me. She stared straight ahead, her posture rigid, her jaw tight. When the teacher called on her for an answer, she fumbled, clearly distracted. When he called on me, I answered confidently, working through a complex problem on the board while the class watched. I heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath when I finished, heard the grudging murmur of impressed classmates. During lunch, her usual table was buzzing with gossip about the dinner. I could hear fragments of conversation as I passed with my tray. Can you believe he made her move? Scholarship student at the head of the table. Never seen Victoria so humiliated. The story was growing more dramatic with each retelling, details being added and embellished. By afternoon, it seemed the entire school knew that Victoria Ashford had been publicly humiliated by her own grandfather, forced to give up her seat to a scholarship student, banished to the children's table like a misbehaving toddler. Some students looked at me with new respect. In chemistry lab, my partner, a beta student named Marcus, who'd always been polite but distant, actually initiated conversation, asking about my plans for college and seeming genuinely interested in my answers. In English class, when we broke into discussion groups, I was invited to join a cluster of students I'd never spoken to before, students who'd previously acted as though I was invisible. Others looked at me with increased resentment. I heard uppity whispered behind my back, heard speculation that I must have done something to manipulate Mrs. Ashford, heard suggestions that I was playing victim to get ahead. Victoria's inner circle closed ranks, their hostility intensifying even as their queen bee sat silent and seething. But I noticed something else too. Other scholarship students, the other Omegas, began to carry themselves differently. In the library that evening, a girl named Maria, who'd never spoken to me before, sat down at my table. She was small and quiet, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She'd been in my English class for 2 years, and we'd never exchanged more than a polite nod. "Is it true?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was listening. "About the dinner?" About what Mr. Ashford said to Victoria? Yes, I said simply, not sure how much detail to share. What was it like? There was hunger in her question, a desperate need to hear that someone like us could win, even once, even briefly. I thought about how to answer, about what she was really asking. She didn't want details about the food or the house or the fancy silverware. She wanted to know if it was possible to stand up to people like Victoria and survive. It was terrifying, I admitted, but it was also empowering. To realize that their judgment doesn't define us, that we have every right to be here, to succeed, to take up space, that someone with real power, someone who actually matters, sees our worth even when they don't. Maria nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her face. My mom cleans houses too, she said, for families like the Ashfords. She works for the Hendersons. They have a daughter here, Brittany, in our year. Brittany acts like my mom is invisible, like she's furniture. Mine too, I replied, feeling a connection forming. She's worked for the Morrison family for 5 years. Their son is in my calculus class. He's never acknowledged that connection, never even looked at me directly. We studied together that evening, and the next, and soon our table in the library had grown to include 5 scholarship students, then 8, then 12. There was James, who wanted to be a doctor and worked nights at a hospital as an orderly. There was Keisha, a brilliant writer whose poetry had been published in national magazines. There was David, a math prodigy who tutored other students to help pay for his books. There was Lily, who'd taught herself 3 languages and dreamed of working in international diplomacy. We formed our own community, supporting each other academically and emotionally, sharing notes and study guides, helping each other navigate the complex social waters of Crescent Moon, refusing to be diminished by the Victorias of the world. We celebrated each other's successes, every A, every award, every acceptance letter. We supported each other through failures and setbacks, through moments of doubt and exhaustion. The internship with the Ashford Foundation began that summer, and it was everything I'd hoped for, and more. I worked on a project redesigning water infrastructure in a low-income neighborhood in Baltimore, applying everything I'd learned in my classes and discovering how much more I had to learn. The work was challenging and fulfilling, requiring me to balance engineering principles with community needs, budget constraints with safety requirements, ideal solutions with practical realities. The neighborhood we were working in reminded me of my own. Narrow streets lined with row houses, corner stores with barred windows, playgrounds with rusty equipment. The residents were skeptical at first, having been promised improvements before that never materialized. But Dr. Chen, the program director, insisted we engage with the community, hold public meetings, listen to their concerns, and incorporate their feedback into our designs. I spent hours talking to residents, learning about the flooding that happened every time it rained hard, the lead contamination in the water supply, the sewage backups that created health hazards. I learned about the political neglect that had allowed these systems to deteriorate, the way infrastructure investment flowed to wealthier neighborhoods while poor communities made do with failing systems from the 1950s. Our team, 5 interns and 3 professional engineers, developed a comprehensive redesign that would address the immediate problems while building in capacity for future needs. We presented our proposal to the city council, and I felt my heart race as I stood before those officials, many of whom looked skeptical that a group that included college students could offer anything valuable. But our data was solid, our design was sound, and our cost-benefit analysis was compelling. The council approved the project, and I felt a surge of pride and accomplishment unlike anything I'd experienced before. This was real. This would actually help people. Alexander Ashford visited the project site twice that summer. He didn't announce his visits in advance, didn't make a big production of it. He simply showed up, wearing khakis and a polo shirt instead of his usual suit, ready to walk through the neighborhood and see the work firsthand. He walked through the streets with genuine interest, talking to residents, asking questions, listening to their concerns with the same focused attention he'd given me at that dinner. "You're doing excellent work, Elena," he told me during his second visit. We were standing in front of a house where we'd just installed new water lines, and the homeowner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Johnson, had hugged me with tears in her eyes, thanking us for finally addressing a problem she'd been complaining about for 20 years. "This community is lucky to have you advocating for them." "I'm lucky to have this opportunity," I replied, watching the construction crew work. "Thank you for believing in me, for giving me this chance." "I didn't give you anything you hadn't already earned," he said, echoing his words from that night. "I simply opened a door. You're the one walking through it. And from what Dr. Chen tells me, you're not just walking, you're running. She says you're the best intern they've had in 5 years. I felt my cheeks flush with pride. Dr. Chen was notoriously hard to impress, demanding excellence and accepting nothing less. Earning her praise meant more than any grade I'd ever received. When I returned to Crescent Moon for my senior year, something had fundamentally changed. The social hierarchy was still there. Old structures die hard, especially in institutions as traditional as Crescent Moon, but it had cracks in it now, visible fissures that hadn't been there before. Scholarship students were more visible, more vocal, more confident. We'd formed clubs and study groups. We participated in student government. We refused to be invisible or apologetic about our presence. I ran for student council president and won, despite Victoria's friend running against me with the full backing of the Alpha Social Circle. My campaign focused on practical issues, improving the food in the cafeteria, extending library hours, creating more study spaces, addressing the lack of financial aid for extracurricular activities that effectively excluded scholarship students from many clubs and sports. I won with 63% of the vote. Victoria and I maintained a cold distance, but the active hostility had faded into mutual avoidance. We moved in different circles, acknowledged each other with curt nods when we passed in hallways, worked together when required in group projects with professional courtesy, but no warmth. She'd learned, perhaps, that cruelty had consequences, even for those born to privilege. Or perhaps she'd simply decided I wasn't worth her energy anymore, that ignoring me was more effective than attacking me. Either way, I didn't care. I had work to do, a future to build, and a promise to keep. To myself, to my mother, to every kid who'd been told they didn't belong in spaces they'd earned the right to occupy. My mother came to campus once that fall, for Parents' Weekend. She'd taken the day off from work, unpaid, because she didn't get vacation days, and taken the bus for 2 hours to reach the school. She looked out of place among the other parents in their expensive casual wear, arriving in luxury cars. She wore her best dress, the one she saved for church, and sensible shoes that had been resoled twice. I gave her a tour of the campus, showing her the library where I spent so many hours, the science building where I'd conducted research, the dormitory where I lived. We had lunch in the cafeteria, and I introduced her to my friends, Maria and James and Keisha and the others. They welcomed her warmly, and I saw her eyes shine with tears she tried to hide. "I'm so proud of you, Mija," she said as we walked through the gardens. "Your father would be so proud. You've accomplished so much." "I learned from you, Mama," I replied, linking my arm through hers. "You taught me that hard work matters, that dignity isn't about money, that we're just as good as anyone else." We passed Victoria and her mother, a woman who looked like an older, more polished version of her daughter, dripping with jewelry and designer labels. They glanced at us, and I saw Victoria's mother's nose wrinkle slightly, saw her whisper something to Victoria. But Victoria's response surprised me. She shook her head slightly, said something back, and her mother's expression shifted to surprise. Later, I would learn from a mutual acquaintance that Victoria had said, "Leave it alone, Mother. She earned her place here." It wasn't friendship, wasn't even respect exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And from Victoria, that was something. The college application season was intense, though my MIT acceptance was already secured. I applied to several other schools as well, Stanford, Berkeley, Cornell, and was accepted to all of them with generous financial aid packages. I had choices, real choices, the kind I'd never imagined having. I chose MIT, of course. It had been my dream school since I was 13, since I'd first read about their civil engineering program and dared to imagine myself there. The full presidential scholarship meant I wouldn't have to work during the school year, could focus entirely on my studies. It meant my mother wouldn't have to sacrifice any more than she already had. The night of the dinner at the Ashford estate had changed my life, but not in the way Victoria had intended. She'd wanted to humiliate me, to put me in my place, to reinforce the social order that elevated her and diminished me. Instead, her grandfather had shown me something far more valuable. That true power comes not from putting others down, but from lifting them up. That belonging isn't granted by the Victorias of the world. It's claimed by those brave enough to walk through doors that others insist should remain closed. I graduated from Crescent Moon Academy as valedictorian, my acceptance to MIT already secured, my future bright with possibility. At the graduation ceremony, Alexander and Eleanor Ashford sat in the audience, beaming with pride as I delivered my speech. They'd insisted on attending, despite Alexander's busy schedule and the fact that I wasn't actually their grandchild. "Your family now," Eleanor had said when I'd protested. "We don't miss family graduations." I spoke about resilience, about the strength that comes from struggle, about the responsibility we all have to open doors for those coming behind us. I talked about the scholarship students who'd come before me, paving the way, and those who would come after, building on what we'd accomplished. I challenged my classmates, all of them, alphas and betas and omegas alike, to think about what kind of world they wanted to build, what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. "We can choose to perpetuate systems that elevate some while diminishing others," I said, my voice carrying across the assembled crowd of students, parents, faculty, and alumni. "We can choose to hoard opportunity, to protect privilege, to maintain hierarchies that serve us at the expense of others. Or we can choose to build something better. We can choose to recognize that talent and worth aren't distributed according to wealth or family name. We can choose to create systems that give everyone a fair chance to succeed." I saw Alexander nodding in the audience, saw Eleanor wiping tears from her eyes. I saw my mother in the front row, her face radiant with pride, wearing a new dress that I'd bought her with money from my summer internship. I saw my friends, my fellow scholarship students, cheering and applauding. Victoria sat with her family, her expression unreadable. When our eyes met across the auditorium, I didn't see hatred anymore, just a kind of resigned acceptance, maybe even a hint of respect. We would never be friends, would never understand each other's worlds fully. But perhaps, in some small way, that night at her family's table had changed her too. Perhaps she'd learned that cruelty has consequences, that privilege comes with responsibility, that the world was changing whether she liked it or not. As I walked off the stage, diploma in hand, I thought about that moment when I'd stood at the threshold of the Ashford dining hall, uncertain and afraid, hearing Victoria declare that I would never sit at their table. I thought about Alexander's commanding voice, about the way power could be wielded for justice instead of cruelty, about the seat of honor I'd occupied and earned. And I smiled, because I knew the truth now. I didn't need their table. I was building my own, and it would have room for everyone. The summer before MIT was a whirlwind. I worked full-time at the Ashford Foundation, now as a paid research assistant rather than an intern. Dr. Chen had offered me the position, saying she wanted to continue working with me, that I had potential she didn't want to see wasted. I spent my days analyzing infrastructure data, developing models, contributing to proposals for new projects. I also spent time with my mother, knowing that once I left for MIT, our time together would be limited. We cooked together, watched movies, took walks through our neighborhood. I saw it with new eyes now, understanding the systemic failures that had created the conditions we lived in. but also seeing the resilience and community that thrived despite those failures. "You're going to do great things, Mija," my mother said one evening as we sat on our small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You're going to change the world." "I'm going to try," I replied. "For you, for Dad, for everyone who deserves better." "No," she corrected gently, "for yourself. You do it for yourself first. That's the only way it's sustainable, the only way you don't burn out. You do it because it's your passion, your calling. The fact that it helps others is a bonus." It was wise advice, and I took it to heart. MIT was everything I'd dreamed of, and more challenging than I'd imagined. The coursework was intense, the competition fierce. But I thrived in that environment, surrounded by brilliant minds, pushed to my limits and beyond. I joined research groups, worked on projects that addressed real-world problems, published papers, won awards. I stayed in touch with Alexander and Eleanor Ashford. We had lunch occasionally when I was home for breaks, and they visited me at MIT once, touring the campus with obvious delight. Alexander gave a guest lecture in one of my classes, talking about the intersection of policy and infrastructure, and my professor was starstruck. Alexander Ashford was a legend in civil engineering circles. "You've done well, Elena," Alexander told me after the lecture. "Better than well. You're exactly what I hoped you'd become when I met you that night." "I had good teachers," I replied, "and someone who believed in me when it mattered most." Years later, after MIT, after my master's degree, after my first major infrastructure project, a sustainable water system in a developing community that won national recognition, I received an invitation to speak at Crescent Moon Academy's annual scholarship dinner. The event was hosted by the Ashford Foundation, and Alexander himself would be presenting the awards. I accepted immediately, feeling a sense of coming full circle. Standing before a room full of scholarship students, kids who looked like I had once looked, uncertain and hopeful and determined, I told them the story of that dinner. I told them about Victoria's words, about Alexander's intervention, about the moment I'd realized that I belonged anywhere I chose to be. The room was silent as I spoke, every eye fixed on me, every student hanging on my words. "You will face people who try to make you feel small," I said, my voice strong and clear. "Who will use words like Omega or scholarship student or charity case as weapons. Who will tell you explicitly or implicitly that you don't belong at their table, and you have a choice in how you respond." I paused, looking out at their young faces, seeing my past self reflected in their eyes. The doubt, the determination, the hunger for something better. You can internalize their judgment, let it define you, let it limit what you believe you can achieve. Or you can prove them wrong, not by becoming like them, not by adopting their values or seeking their approval, but by being so undeniably excellent, so committed to your purpose, so clear in your worth that their opinions become irrelevant. You prove them wrong by succeeding on your own terms, by building the life you want, by refusing to be diminished. The applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls of the dining hall, the same dining hall where I'd once stood at the threshold, afraid and uncertain. After the ceremony, students lined up to talk to me, to share their own stories of discrimination and determination, to ask advice about college and careers and how to navigate a world that often seemed designed to exclude them. I spoke with each one, gave them my contact information, promised to stay in touch. I remembered how much it had meant to me when Alexander had believed in me, and I wanted to pay that forward, to be that person for someone else. Alexander approached as the crowd was thinning. He was older now, moving more slowly, using a cane that he hadn't needed when I first met him. But his eyes were as sharp and kind as ever, his presence still commanding. "That was a wonderful speech, Elena," he said, his voice warm with pride. "You've become exactly what I knew you would be. More, actually. You've exceeded even my expectations." Because you gave me a chance, I replied, feeling emotion tighten my throat. No, he corrected gently, as he had so many times before. Because you seized the chance you'd already earned. I simply made sure the door wasn't locked. You're the one who walked through it and then held it open for others. We stood together, watching the scholarship students mingle and network, building connections and confidence, supporting each other the way my friends and I had done. Victoria's here tonight, you know, Alexander said quietly. On the board now. She voted to double the scholarship program's funding. Actually championed it, from what Eleanor tells me. I turned to him in surprise, genuinely shocked. Really? People can change, he said, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, but they can change. That dinner affected her more than she'd ever admit. She's not you, Elena. She'll never have your drive or your purpose, but she's learning in her own way what it means to use privilege responsibly. She's learning that the world doesn't revolve around her comfort, that other people's worth isn't determined by their bank accounts. I spotted Victoria across the room, talking to a group of students. She'd matured, her features less sharp, her manner less imperious. She looked up, caught my eye, and for the first time in years she smiled. A small, genuine smile that held something like respect, maybe even admiration. I smiled back, feeling something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to. The old anger, the old resentment, the need to prove myself to her. It all fell away. I didn't need her approval or her respect. But it was nice to have it anyway. Nice to know that growth was possible even for people like her. Because in the end, that's what the story was really about. Not revenge or triumph over enemies, but the slow, difficult work of building a better world. A world where talented kids from poor neighborhoods could sit at any table they chose. Where scholarship students weren't omegas but equals. Where the doors that had been locked for generations were finally, permanently, thrown open. Alexander Ashford had shown me that such a world was possible. And now, it was my turn to build it, brick by brick, project by project, student by student. As I left Crescent Moon Academy that evening, driving past the grand buildings and manicured lawns that had once intimidated me so much, I thought about the girl I'd been, scared, uncertain, standing at the threshold of the Ashford dining hall. I thought about how far I'd come, about the doors I'd walked through and the ones I'd opened for others. And I thought about Victoria's words, the ones that had been meant to wound and diminish. That Omega will never sit at our table. She'd been wrong. I'd sat at their table, in the seat of honor, and I'd earned every moment of it. But more importantly, I'd learned that I didn't need their table to have value, to have worth, to have a place in this world. I'd built my own table. And it was big enough for everyone. 5 years had passed since that speech at Crescent Moon Academy. 5 years of building my career, establishing my reputation, and working on projects that made a tangible difference in people's lives. I designed water systems for 3 underserved communities, consulted on sustainable housing developments in 4 cities, and published research that was being cited by engineers and urban planners across the country. My work had earned me recognition, awards, speaking invitations, job offers from prestigious firms, but I'd chosen a different path. Instead of joining a major engineering corporation where I could have earned a substantial salary, I'd founded my own nonprofit organization, Equitable Infrastructure Initiative. Our mission was simple but ambitious: to provide pro bono engineering services to communities that couldn't afford them, to advocate for policy changes that would prioritize infrastructure investment in neglected neighborhoods, and to train the next generation of engineers who understood that their work had profound social implications. It was challenging work, often frustrating, always underfunded. But it was exactly what I'd dreamed of doing since I was 12 years old, watching my neighborhood flood while wealthier areas remained dry. On a crisp October morning, I received an unexpected phone call. The number was familiar, the Ashford estate. My heart clenched with sudden worry. Alexander had been in declining health for the past year, and I'd visited him several times at the hospital and at home. Each visit, he seemed a little more frail, a little more tired, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. "Elena?" It was Eleanor's voice, and I could hear the tremor in it. "I'm so glad I reached you. Alexander. He's asking for you. The doctors say it won't be long now. He wants to see you." "I'll be there within the hour," I said, already grabbing my keys. The drive to the Ashford estate felt both endless and too short. I wasn't ready to say goodbye to the man who'd changed my life, who'd seen my worth when so many others had dismissed me, who'd opened doors and then taught me how to hold them open for others. Eleanor met me at the door, her eyes red from crying, but her composure intact. She'd always been strong, a perfect match for Alexander's principled determination. "He's upstairs in his study. He insisted on being there rather than in bed. You know how stubborn he is." I did know. It was one of the things I'd always admired about him. The study was exactly as I remembered it from the few times I'd been invited there. Walls lined with books, a massive desk covered with papers and photographs, windows overlooking the gardens. Alexander sat in a leather chair by the window, a blanket across his lap, despite the warmth of the room. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by illness. But when he saw me, his face lit up with genuine joy. "Elena," he said, his voice weaker than it had been, but still carrying that note of warmth I remembered. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." I took the chair across from him, fighting back tears. "Of course I came. How are you feeling?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Dying, apparently. The doctors are very insistent about it, but I'm not interested in talking about that. I want to talk about you, about your work. Eleanor showed me the article in the Times about your project in Detroit. Brilliant work, Elena. Absolutely brilliant." "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I learned from the best." "No," he said, echoing words he'd spoken so many times before. "You had the passion and the talent. I just made sure you had the opportunity to use them. There's a difference." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and I noticed his gaze drifting to a photograph on his desk, a picture from my graduation from Crescent Moon, showing him and Eleanor with me, all of us beaming. "You know," he said finally, "that dinner, the night we first met, that wasn't planned. Eleanor had told me about you, about your achievements, and I'd intended to come home early to meet you. But when I walked in and heard Victoria speaking to you that way, I was ashamed. Ashamed that my own granddaughter had learned so little about what truly matters, about how to treat people with dignity and respect." He paused, catching his breath. Eleanor had quietly entered the room and stood by the door, listening. "I've thought about that night often over the years," Alexander continued. "About the look on your face when you stood at that threshold, trying to decide whether to run or stay. About the courage it took for you to walk into that room, knowing you'd be judged, knowing you didn't fit their narrow definition of belonging. That took more strength than most people will ever have to summon in their entire lives. You gave me the courage to stay," I said softly. "You showed me that not everyone with power uses it to hurt people, that some people use it to lift others up." "And you've done the same," he replied. "Eleanor and I have been following your work closely. We know about the young engineers you're mentoring, about the scholarship fund you established for students from low-income backgrounds who want to study civil engineering. You're building exactly the kind of legacy that matters." He reached into the folder on the table beside him and pulled out a document. His hands shook slightly as he held it out to me. "I want you to have this." I took the document, confused, and began to read. It was a legal document, dense with formal language, but the meaning became clear as I scanned the pages. Alexander had established a substantial endowment, $10 million, to fund my nonprofit organization. The money would be distributed over 10 years, providing stable funding that would allow us to expand our work exponentially. Mr. Ashford, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's not nearly enough, he said firmly, some of his old strength returning to his voice. Do you know what my greatest regret is, Elena? That I didn't do more sooner. I established the scholarship program at Crescent Moon, yes, and I'm proud of that. But I could have done so much more. I could have used my wealth and influence to create systemic change, to address the root causes of inequality, rather than just helping a few individuals overcome it. He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense despite his physical frailty. You're doing the work I should have done decades ago. You're not just helping individuals, you're changing systems. You're proving that infrastructure investment in poor communities isn't charity, it's justice. That everyone deserves clean water and safe bridges and functional sewage systems, regardless of their zip code or bank balance. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't try to hide them. Thank you. Thank you for believing in me, for supporting me, for showing me what's possible. Thank you, he replied, for proving that the scholarship program was worth fighting for showing everyone who doubted that talent and determination matter more than pedigree and wealth, for becoming exactly the kind of person this world needs more of. Eleanor came forward then, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder. There's something else, Elena. Victoria wants to see you. She's downstairs. Would you be willing to speak with her? I was surprised, but I nodded. Of course. Good, Alexander said, settling back in his chair with visible relief. She has something she wants to say to you, something she should have said years ago. I found Victoria in the same dining hall where we'd first clashed all those years ago. She stood by the window, looking out at the gardens, and when she turned to face me, I was struck by how much she'd changed. The sharp edges had softened. The arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Elena, she said, her voice quiet. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I don't deserve your time. What did you want to talk about? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself. I want to apologize. Really apologize. Not the forced apology my grandfather made me give that night. I was cruel to you, Elena. Deliberately, systematically cruel. I made your life at Crescent Moon harder than it needed to be, and I did it because I was threatened by you. I must have looked surprised, because she gave a small, sad smile. It's true, she continued. You were everything I pretended to be. Smart, hardworking, genuinely accomplished. I coasted on my family name and my trust fund, and I knew it. Deep down, I knew I hadn't earned anything I had. And seeing someone who'd actually worked for everything, who'd overcome obstacles I couldn't even imagine, it forced me to confront how empty my achievements were. She walked closer, her hands clasped in front of her. That night at dinner, when my grandfather made me move, when he put you in my seat, I was humiliated, yes, but I was also forced to see myself through his eyes. And I didn't like what I saw. I didn't like the person I'd become. So you changed, I said softly. I tried to change, she corrected. It's been a process. I went to therapy. I volunteered at a community center in a low-income neighborhood. I actually started working. Really working. Not just showing up to a cushy job my father arranged. I joined the board at Crescent Moon and fought to expand the scholarship program. I've tried to use my privilege for something other than my own comfort. She paused, her eyes meeting mine directly. I'm not telling you this to earn your forgiveness or your approval. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that your presence in my life, as uncomfortable as it was, made me a better person. You held up a mirror, and I didn't like what I saw, and that was exactly what I needed. I didn't know what to say. This was not the Victoria I'd known, not the cruel girl who'd made my life miserable. This was someone who'd done the hard work of confronting her own failings and trying to grow beyond them. I appreciate you telling me this, I said finally. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you found a better path. There's one more thing, Victoria said, reaching into her bag and pulling out an envelope. I've made a donation to your organization. It's not as much as my grandfather's endowment, but it's substantial. And I want to do more. I want to volunteer, if you'll have me. I have connections, resources, access to people who could support your work. I want to use those things to help, if you're willing to let me. I took the envelope, feeling its weight. Inside was a check for $500,000. Victoria, It's the least I can do, she interrupted. You're doing work that matters, Elena. Work that actually changes lives. I want to be part of that, even in a small way. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and see someone who contributes something meaningful to the world. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw genuine sincerity in her eyes. People could change. Alexander had said it, and here was the proof standing in front of me. All right, I said. Let's talk about how you can help. We spent the next hour discussing my organization's work, the projects we had planned, the obstacles we faced. Victoria listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and made suggestions that showed she'd actually done research about infrastructure equity and community development. She wasn't the same person who'd sneered at my thrift store dress. She'd grown, evolved, become someone who understood that privilege was a responsibility, not just a benefit. When I left the Ashford estate that afternoon, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. I'd said my goodbyes to Alexander, knowing it would likely be the last time I saw him alive. He'd held my hand and told me he was proud of me, that I'd exceeded every hope he'd had when he'd first met me. You didn't just walk through the door I opened, he'd said. You kicked down walls. You built new doors. You changed the architecture of possibility. That's what legacy really means, Elena. Not the buildings that bear your name, but the lives you've changed and the systems you've transformed. Alexander Ashford passed away 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was attended by hundreds, politicians and business leaders, former students and scholarship recipients, community activists and ordinary people whose lives he'd touched. I gave one of the eulogies, speaking about the man who'd seen potential in a scared scholarship student and had given her not just opportunity, but belief in her own worth. Victoria sat in the front row with her family, and when our eyes met, she nodded slightly, a gesture of respect and shared understanding. We would never be close friends. Too much history stood between us, but we'd found a way to work together, to channel our different forms of privilege and experience toward a common goal. In the months that followed, my organization expanded dramatically. The endowment from Alexander allowed us to hire more engineers, take on more projects, reach more communities. Victoria proved to be an invaluable ally, using her connections to open doors that would have remained closed to me, leveraging her social capital to advocate for policy changes that would prioritize infrastructure investment in neglected neighborhoods. We worked together on a major project in a low-income community outside Boston, a comprehensive redesign of their water, sewage, and stormwater systems. Victoria attended community meetings with me, listened to residents' concerns, and used her influence with city officials to ensure the project received proper funding and attention. She showed up in khakis and work boots, willing to get her hands dirty, willing to learn from the engineers and the community members. One evening, as we were reviewing project plans in my office, Victoria looked up from the blueprints and said, "You know, I used to think power meant making other people feel small. That's what I saw growing up. People using their wealth and status to elevate themselves by diminishing others. But watching you work, watching my grandfather, I've learned that real power is the opposite. It's making other people feel capable, valued, seen. Your grandfather taught me the same thing," I replied. That night at dinner, he could have just told you to be quiet and moved on. But he made a point. He showed everyone in that room that cruelty has consequences, that privilege comes with responsibility, that the social hierarchies we accept as natural are actually choices we make. He was a remarkable man, Victoria said softly. I wish I'd understood that sooner. I wish I'd learned from him earlier, instead of wasting so many years being exactly the kind of person he despised. You're learning now, I said. That's what matters. Growth isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing a different future. 2 years after Alexander's death, my organization completed its largest project yet, a comprehensive infrastructure overhaul in a community that had been neglected for decades. The project included new water treatment facilities, upgraded sewage systems, green infrastructure for stormwater management, and improved roads and bridges. It was a model of sustainable, equitable development, and it attracted national attention. The day we celebrated the project's completion, with community members and city officials and journalists all gathered to mark the occasion, I thought about that night at the Ashford Dining Hall. I thought about standing at the threshold, hearing Victoria say that I would never sit at their table, feeling the weight of all the doors that had been closed to people like me, and I thought about Alexander's intervention, about the way he'd used his power to open a door, to show me that I belonged anywhere I chose to be, to teach me that the most important thing you can do with privilege is share it, dismantle it, use it to create a world where it matters less. I'd sat at their table. I'd proven I belonged. But more importantly, I'd learned that the goal wasn't to gain acceptance into their exclusive spaces. It was to break down the walls that made those spaces exclusive in the first place. As I stood before the crowd, preparing to speak, I saw Victoria in the audience. She'd been instrumental in securing funding for this project, had volunteered hundreds of hours, had used every connection she had to make it happen. She caught my eye and smiled, a genuine smile of shared accomplishment. I smiled back, thinking about how far we'd both come from that night. She'd learned to use her privilege responsibly. I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by whether people like her accepted me. And together we'd learned that change was possible. Slow, difficult, imperfect, but possible. This project represents more than new pipes and improved drainage, I said to the assembled crowd. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about infrastructure, about community, about whose needs matter. For too long, we've accepted a system where investment flows to wealthy neighborhoods, while poor communities make do with failing systems from decades past. We've accepted that some people deserve clean water and safe streets, while others don't. I paused, looking out at the faces before me. Community residents who'd lived with flooding and contamination for years. Young engineers I'd mentored who were carrying forward this work. City officials who'd been convinced to prioritize equity. And Victoria, who'd traveled such a long journey from the cruel girl she'd been. But we don't have to accept that system. We can build something better. We can create infrastructure that serves everyone, not just the privileged few. We can design cities that work for all their residents. We can choose equity over convenience, justice over tradition. And when we do, everyone benefits. Everyone. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most to me were the faces of the residents. The elderly woman who'd lived with contaminated water for 20 years. The young mother who'd worried about her children playing in streets that flooded with sewage. The teenager who was now considering studying engineering because he'd seen what was possible. This was the table I'd built. Not a table where some sat in honor, while others were banished to the far end. Not a table where belonging was determined by wealth or family name. But a table where everyone had a seat, where everyone's needs mattered, where everyone had the opportunity to contribute and thrive. That evening, as the celebration wound down and people began to depart, Victoria approached me. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For letting me be part of this. For giving me the chance to do something meaningful. For showing me what it looks like to use privilege and power for something other than self-interest." She paused, her expression thoughtful. My grandfather was right about you, you know? That night at dinner after you left, he told my grandmother that you were going to change the world. And you have. We're changing it together, I corrected. You, me, everyone who's chosen to prioritize equity and justice. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because enough people decide that the old way isn't acceptable anymore. As I drove home that night, exhausted but fulfilled, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From that 2-bedroom apartment with the flickering streetlights, to MIT, to founding my own organization, to completing projects that genuinely improved people's lives. From standing at the threshold of the Ashford Dining Hall, uncertain and afraid, to building a career and a legacy based on the principles Alexander had modeled for me. Victoria had said I would never sit at their table. She'd meant it as a dismissal, a reminder that I didn't belong in their world. But she'd been wrong in ways she couldn't have imagined. I had sat at their table, and then I'd built a bigger, better table where everyone belonged. And that, I realized, was the real story. Not about revenge or triumph over enemies, not about gaining acceptance into exclusive spaces, but about the hard, necessary work of dismantling the systems that create exclusion in the first place. About using whatever power and privilege you have to open doors, to create opportunities, to build a world where talent and determination matter more than the circumstances of your birth. Alexander Ashford had shown me that such a world was possible. And now, with Victoria's unlikely partnership, and the support of countless others who'd chosen equity over tradition, I was helping to build it. One table at a time, one project at a time, one open door at a time, until the day when no one would ever again be told they didn't belong.